Good afternoon, everyone. Are we live? Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Jonathan Rowson. I'm just going to extend a quick RSA welcome. I know you didn't come to hear me today. Housekeeping briefly, our hashtag for today is RSA Climate, if you're on Twitter. Otherwise, keep your phones on silent, please. We don't want interruptions. We're being recorded today for posterity and for future YouTube views and podcasts and so forth. There will be a chance to ask questions later. It's obviously an enormous pleasure to introduce our speakers. But before I do that, I want to just give a little broader context to this project. As some of you may know, the RSA has been working for about a year on a project called the 7 Dimensions of Climate Change. It was an attempt to reimagine what this problem is. Something that's often assumed to be a merely environmental issue is actually a much bigger issue. Those 7 dimensions traverse everything from science setting the agenda, to law speaking about constraints at scale, to technology saying what is possible, what is feasible, to money saying, well, where does the money go, what is affordable, what can we do, democracy dealing with collective action problems, culture speaking about how much are we talking about this, how much do we know about it, what do we feel about it, and behavior, what do we do about it. And climate change is all of these things. And once you begin to realize that, the solutions that emerge to the problem look rather different. You begin to see that it's a much tougher but more fascinating problem than you can imagine. I was a professional chess player for many years, and I can assure you that climate change is 1,000 times more interesting than perhaps the most interesting game on the planet. It really is an extraordinarily tough problem for humanity to solve, if indeed we can solve it, if indeed that's the right framing. Now, to my right, David Attenborough is going to introduce Tim in more detail. So I'm initially going to just say something about Tim's book, The Atmosphere of Hope, or Atmosphere of Hope, Solutions to the Climate Crisis. The word solutions is important, and the book goes into a particular argument there, which Tim will now develop. David is here to speak more about that work and Tim's ideas. But obviously, many of you have come here because I would say probably a voice as much as anything else, not just an image, not just a man, but actually a voice that stays in the soul. The timbre of David Attenborough's voice is perhaps singular and inimitable, and something that sort of stays with you as a kind of warm buzz many hours after you've heard it. He's been called the godfather of natural history TV. He's introduced generations to the world's furry and feathered friends. He's had a huge influence as a broadcaster, introducing colour TV when he was controller at BBC Two. Born in 1926, so he's 89 now, Attenborough collected fossils as a child and gained natural science degrees from Cambridge. Since the launch of his famous Zoo Quest series in 1954 to the recent Planet Earth, he has surveyed almost every aspect of life on Earth. Whether he's chilling with chimps or freezing with polar bears, Attenborough always reassures with his signature dulcet tones. This is from my colleague, I wanted to copy this. Many have tried and most failed to capture his hushed, reverential whisper, full of barely contained excitement. This unique voice has formed the soundtrack to millions of childhoods and TV dinners. Now we'll come on, you'll begin to hear that in a moment. But before you do, some of you may have seen outside, I'll just briefly mention a report the RSA released today called Money Talks. It might be a somewhat different approach to the climate solution than Tim proposes in a moment, but almost all of these things will be part of the picture, and we need to start thinking about the issue as systemically and fully as possible. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce, David will introduce Tim. So please welcome David Attenborough. Thank you.
Thank you for that very fulsome introduction. I'm here to ask questions. I am not an expert on climate change, so I am here, like you, to learn what I can from Tim. I'm also here, I hope, as one of Tim's old friends. He is an extraordinary polymathic man. He's an explorer. He's a very distinguished taxonomist. He's a great authority on marsupials, both of not only Australia but the whole of the Southwest Pacific. He is a historian, and he has taken a lot of enterprising publications of taking the important documents of Australian exploration and making sure that they were reprinted. He's a museum director. He's knows New Guinea very well as the islands of the Pacific. In fact, he's all these multitudinous things. And I've watched what he's done with admiration for a long time. And getting on for 10 years ago, when he was actually, I think you were director of one of the Australian Museum at that time, Tim rang me up and said, this is 10 years ago, Mark, I've been worrying a long time now about what is happening to this planet of ours. And I've decided that I really should stop doing all these different things and that I should resign from this very distinguished post that he had and devote myself to the problems who could have gone any direction. Since then, he's written a number of books, as I'm sure you will all know, but there is now this one. So many problems or comments or solutions to the problems that we are planning are military ones. They are, or rather, the solutions are military. They threaten. They say, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, you mustn't do the other. That is why a volume that says An Atmosphere of Hope seems to me a marvelous start. As I said, I haven't read it. This is the first time I've seen it. And I'm going to ask Tim to say what's in it and how it can be described as hope. Because, my goodness, we need hope on this issue. Tim.
Could I begin by just thanking you, David, for being here today? I know how incredibly busy you are, and I'm very, very grateful, as I'm sure everyone else here is, for your time here. The book really is, I wrote it because I felt that we were losing sight of some important elements in engaging with this climate problem. Perhaps it's just human nature, but we tend to drill down to the very local. So with what's happening in various countries around the world, a lot of people are thinking about very vital issues, but that are kind of local and short term. And we tend to lose track of the longer term trajectory of the problem. And we do need to keep that in mind if we want to find genuine solutions. And my starting point for identifying those genuine solutions was a pretty hard and uncompromising look at where we are now. And where we are now is at the end, we hope, of a decade of what the scientists call the worst case scenario emissions trajectory. So we've been emitting greenhouse gases now at the highest rate that was imaginable a decade or 2 decades ago. And the scale of the problem has grown beyond anything really anyone could have anticipated, even a decade ago, I'd say. Last year, 40 gigatons of CO2 was put into the atmosphere from all human activities, from combined human activities. It's an unimaginably large amount, but we need to really come to grips with it. And one way of doing that really is to ask ourselves, well, what would we need to do to take, say, 1/10 of that volume of CO2 out of the atmosphere by doing something we all understand, like planting trees. I mean, trees are really just congealed carbon dioxide. They grow from atmospheric CO2 and are a store of atmospheric CO2. So how many trees would we need to plant to, say, draw 4 gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere? It turns out you'd need to plant an area the size of Australia with trees to draw just 1/10 of current emissions out of the atmosphere. So the volumes of CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere now are indisputably of consequence in terms of the way Earth's system works. They've already elevated temperatures above the pre-industrial levels that prevailed before 200 years ago by a degree, this year 1 degree Celsius. Moreover, there's enough gas in the air, greenhouse gas in the air, to warm Earth's average temperature by another 0.5 degree. So we are committed to living in a world 2 or 3 decades from now that is 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average. And I'm sure, David, you appreciate some of the consequences of that because you've just been on the Great Barrier Reef filming and you've probably spoken to experts like Ove, Professor Gülhulberg. And he's told me that it's very doubtful that the Barrier Reef can survive at 1.5 degrees of warming. But that's what we're committed to. And that's why I say we've got to take a hard look at this. We can't resile from the facts as we look for hope in this. As we speak, there's a great meeting in Paris that we hope will be the last of the negotiating meetings to broker a deal to deal with climate change. But there's no one who realistically hopes that that meeting can reduce emissions fast enough to see us avoid 2 degrees of warming. In all of the projection work that's done by the scientists suggests that it's now, given that decade of lost opportunity we've come through, extremely difficult, if not impossible, to avoid 2 degrees of warming by cutting emissions alone. So when I look around the world at where we are, we can see that 1 degree of warming has had quite severe consequences in everything from heat waves to fire behaviour to rising sea levels, through to biological impacts. The bark beetle impacts in Western North America are enormous, and changes anyway across the planet. Ocean acidification, another issue that's now starting to bite at just 1 degree of warming. So those problems are going to grow. We're not going to be able to cut emissions fast enough to avoid 2 degrees. And there are some consequences of that. There are 4 research groups in China, for example, who are now actively pursuing research into what we call geoengineering. These are attempts to alter Earth's climate by affecting how much sunlight reaches Earth's surface. One proposal is that we inject sulphur into the stratosphere and that will cool Earth. The Chinese research and other research shows us that that is a relatively cheap solution. There are probably wealthy individuals on Earth who could afford to do that just out of their own budget. It's instantly effective at cooling the temperature, but it acts just as a band-aid on the system. The problem continues to fester underneath. There's no global treaty regulating geoengineering, so there's nothing to stop China doing it tomorrow if they so wished. And that's my great fear, that as climate impacts worsen, a nation will decide unilaterally to act, take a geoengineering proposal and enact it. And that will have very severe adverse consequences on the rest of the planet. You can't put sulphur into the stratosphere without having an impact on Earth's circulation system and climate systems. It will have adverse impacts. So I can see that without a third way, a third tool to deal with this problem, we are headed into some very, very serious problems by the middle of this century. That's how I'd been feeling really for the last decade. I couldn't see much hope. That was the scenario I could see unfolding as every year brought worse news about the emissions. What's changed over the last couple of years for me, however, is I've understood that there is another way to deal with this problem. There is a third way of dealing with this problem. And that third way involves a series of technologies and methods and approaches that have the potential to draw large volumes of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We can't do it yet, the technologies are not mature yet, but there is enough evidence from desk-based studies, from early stage development, and even some industries that are now operating, that this is achievable. If we're to do that, however, if we're to be drawing gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere by mid-century, we need to begin the investment process now. We know from the development pathways of clean technology, wind and solar, that it takes decades to go from an idea or a laboratory test of something through to a large-scale deployment of wind and solar. So that's why I wrote this book, really, was to outline how serious the problem is, that, as it is now, to at least make people aware of some of the hazards, like geoengineering, that I think are not widely understood by the public, but also to inform people that there are solutions, but they're not easy solutions, and they're solutions that we need to start acting on now if we hope to have them ready in time to avoid serious warming.
Okay, solution number 1.
Well, perhaps, that's good. Could I begin, David, by just talking about those third-way technologies in a form of classification? I'm a taxonomist, so we can perhaps do it through a taxonomic approach. There's 2 basic streams in third-way technologies. One of them I call broadly the biological, and we all understand the biological pathway. Its power source is the sun, the capture mechanism is green plants. They take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it. And they're a very important element in Earth's self-regulatory system in terms of greenhouse gases. One of the problems with them, I mean, there's many advantages to them. We all understand them. That there's quite large-scale industries around forestry and forest products use and even biochar. But one of the drawbacks, as you might gather from that first example I gave of how many trees you need to plant to draw a tenth of the emissions out, is that they're rather limited in scale compared with the problem. You know, Earth's land-based ecosystems are already under a large degree of stress. They're providing food and fibre and shelter for a population now of more than 7 billion people. To ask them to store carbon on a large scale as well is a big ask. I think that, you know, forestry and the biochar industry, which, you know, it uses plant products to make charcoal, which can then be stored in soils, they're going to be valuable, they're going to be part of the solution, but they're not going to be a big part of the solution, just because of the scale of the problem. If you want kind of large-scale solutions, you really have to go offshore and have a look at what the oceans can do. It turns out that seaweed is phenomenal stuff. As you doubtless know, it grows 30 to 60 times faster than land-based plants. Kelp, the kind of things around the coast here, they grow 0.5 metre a day at times. And they're capturing CO2 directly from seawater, so they buffer the seawater, they reduce the acidity. There's a desktop study that's been done that suggests that if we were to plant out 9% of the world's oceans with seaweed farms, we could draw down the equivalent of all of the carbon dioxide we're currently putting into the atmosphere on an annual basis. And in addition to that, that area of seaweed farms would give you enough areas to grow enough protein in forms of fish and prawns and shellfish or whatever to feed a population of 10 billion. So there's a lot of potential there. But so this is a desktop study, as I mentioned. I did a quick calculation on how big 9% of the world's oceans is. It's a frighteningly large area, 4.5 times the size of Australia. So we know seaweed farms work. There's 500 square kilometres of them off the coast of China today. We know that we could be deploying them at scale. There's some very interesting approaches that I've just learnt about in the US to do this. But growing a seaweed industry to that sort of scale is, it's an awesomely large undertaking.
One of the problems with seaweed is that an awful lot of it is rooted on the seabed. So you are limited, therefore, surely, to the rather shallower waters. But there's also floating seaweed, the sargassum, which doesn't require that. Could you foresee this coming out in mid-ocean or areas that are not used particularly by shipping lanes and so on?
Well, one of the proposals that there's actually an early prototype of concerns developing square kilometre arrays of seaweed farms in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, so midway between California and Australia. And these are floating racks that would be 25 metres below the surface of the water, so the seaweed's still getting enough sunlight, but they're deep enough down that supertankers can pass over the top of them without damage. The nutrients that are required are produced by a pipe that goes down to about 300 metres in depth and uses solar power to slowly pump that water up and fertilise the seaweed. And this is a real life proposal. I said there's a prototype out there and people are now fundraising for large scale.
Who's doing the prototype?
This is out of Stanford University. It's a group of engineers at Stanford University. And their big driver is the protein you can grow in these seaweed farms, you know, the fish and so forth. We're yet to work out how you would, what you would do with the seaweed. You know, you'd have to perhaps have biodigesters or methane generators and generate electricity. Then you have to have a way of storing the carbon dioxide that the seaweed has captured. One option for that is to pump it down into marine sediments under 3 kilometres of water, and there the pressure of the water column holds the CO2 in a liquid form, and it forms a solid in those sediments fairly quickly. So that's one of the options. We're obviously a long way off from being able to do this, and we need a lot more R&D to see, you know, how feasible this is and how safe it is. But these are some of the options that are currently being progressed under the biological pathways.
Okay, that's solution number one.
Yes.
Number two.
Number two, well, let's go. The other great group of solutions are called broadly the chemical pathways, and they're very, very varied. most of them need a source of energy from the human energy system. And one of the drawbacks of that is at the moment we produce electricity by burning fossil fuels and energy, transport and so forth by burning fossil fuels. So until we green the systems, until we can get more clean energy into these systems, it doesn't make much sense to follow some of the chemical pathways. But let me run through some of the more prospective ones. One of the more exciting for me is the development of carbon negative concretes. These are concretes which don't generate any CO2 in their manufacture, but they absorb CO2 from the atmosphere as the concrete cures over time. These concretes are already in existence, but they're very, very small scale production at the moment. You know, concretes today, concrete manufacture or cement manufacture, about 5% of global emissions of CO2 come from that process of making cement for concrete. So there's a big potential there. We could be dealing here with a gigaton scale solution. But the engineers have an issue with carbon negative concrete. So the manufacturers claim that the concrete is lighter, stronger and more durable than conventional concretes. But of course it doesn't have a very long track record. So no one's going to build multi-storey buildings out of this stuff until it develops that track record. You know, conventional Portland-based cements and concretes go back virtually to Roman times. They're an ancient technology, so engineers understand them and know how they work. But I think we need to start developing those carbon negative concretes as an industry if we're to be using them to sequester CO2 and avoid emissions of CO2 on the gigaton scale in 2050.
But you'll have to have a kind of concrete sink, won't you? I mean, because humanity is keeping on producing CO2, so you're going to have to keep on taking it out of the atmosphere. So you're going to create an enormous area of concrete, volume of concrete.
I think, I must say, David, my sense is that we need to cut emissions hard and fast, you know, from all sources. And we can't look at these third-way technologies as just being an offset for allowing us to continue to pollute. If we're to avoid 2 degrees of warming, we have to do all in our power to cut emissions now, but also invest in these solutions. And I think we don't want to just be making concrete to absorb CO2. What we want to do is replace our current requirements for concrete with greener solutions and, you know, CO2 absorbing solutions. And that is where, you know, if you just do that, you're still getting up to a gigaton or so of carbon out of the atmosphere per annum, which is about 3.7 gigatons of CO2. So I tend to frame the solutions that way, really. And I think that's a real live one. I think that's one we could develop. If we had a sectoral carbon price in place, for example, or an emissions trading scheme just for the concrete sector, it would hasten the uptake of some of these solutions. But just to go on to another one of the chemical pathways, another one I find quite fascinating is the use of silicate rocks to absorb carbon dioxide. You know, these rocks are formed at the mid-ocean ridge and over geological time they're often incorporated into continental land masses. They can be mined and ground up and so that they weather faster, and as they weather they absorb CO2 out of the atmosphere. So they're again part of Earth's natural self-regulatory system in terms of CO2 drawdown, but we can hasten that process by mining rock and putting it in an area where it'll weather. You know, if you mined 5 to 6 gigatons of silicate rock globally and ground it up and strew it on beaches, for example, to enrich beaches with beach sand, you'd be drawing down 3 or 4 gigatons of CO2
But using a lot
year.
of energy to do it.
Exactly, and this is the problem. At the moment, quarrying and grinding rock is very energy intensive. Until we green our energy systems, that is not going to be a proposal we can really deploy at scale. But I think we need to do the R&D on it. We need to do the research and development on it to understand better how we could do it at scale, and then perhaps start using, where we do have cleaner energy sources, start using those to start experimenting with this to see what the drawdown rates are like. But it's another one I can imagine by 2050 that we could be drawing down significant amounts of CO2. Perhaps if I could just break the narrative up a little bit too by just thinking about 2050, because I know I keep mentioning this as the year that we, that these technologies may reach maturity around about 2050. A lot of people perhaps feel that what I'm talking about is a bit like science fiction, doing this at the gigaton scale at that point. And I struggled with that myself as I wrote the book, and really the only way I could come to terms with understanding what 2050 might be like is to cast myself back a century and to imagine I was living in 1915 and trying to understand 1950 rather than 2015 and 2050. And if you do that, it's interesting. I mean, in London here, we would be living in a horse-drawn era in 1915. You know, there'd be a great war happening on the continent without any tanks. There was no tanks on the battlefield in 1915. There was a few aircraft, but they were only used for surveillance. Cavalry charges were still being used. You know, the maps in schoolrooms that explained what the globe was like would have been colour-coded according to the European empires of the day. And there wasn't a communist country in existence. And, you know, cast yourself forward to 1950 and you're living in a nuclear era with jet aircraft and communism, you know, seemingly covering half the globe. I mean, it sounds like science fiction to a 1915 ear. And I think we have to keep that in mind as we think about 1950 and the potential of these technologies, because the pace of change has only increased this century compared with last. So when we talk about these large-scale deployments of these technologies, we have to just keep the imaginative possibility open that 2050 will be very different from 2015.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yes, good. All right.
Next.
The other technologies in that chemical pathway, they're very varied and very bitty, so I'll just go through a few. One concerns the manufacture of plastics directly from atmospheric CO2. I've held in my hand a little bit of plastic made from atmospheric CO2, mobile phone cover. You know, probably the most expensive mobile phone cover in the known universe. You know, but it exists. People can do this. You know, so plastics from CO2, we could replace a lot of fossil fuel use through developing those technologies and bringing them to scale and making them cheaper. We'd have to double the amount of plastics we use, unfortunately, all derived from atmospheric CO2 if we were even to draw down a gigaton of carbon per annum using that technique. So that will be a small part of a future solution. There are other groups, Siemens, and I worked with Siemens on and off for a decade looking at their clean energy technologies. They have developed an approach using overnight wind energy in Germany, which nobody wants. There's a lot of wind, wind electricity generation overnight, to take a water bath with CO2, enriched with CO2, and to make long-chain hydrocarbons out of it. And once you've done that, you can use that atmospheric CO2 for anything from fertilisers to plastics to substitutes for liquid fuels. That is a real technology that exists now, but is just at a very nascent stage. Just 2 months ago, an announcement was made out of the University of Washington that researchers had discovered how to make carbon fibres directly from atmospheric CO2. And that, to me, is a huge breakthrough.
Just before we leave plastics, may I ask a question? A matter that worries me to death, as it worries, I'm sure, to you and many in this room, is the pervasive quality of plastics and the irreducibility of it. I was making a film, or contributing to a film, which started with an albatross chick waiting for its parent to come back after a trans-globe journey gathering food. And the parent comes, opens her bill, the chick opens its bill, and what pours from the parent? Plastic. Solid, indigestible, poisonous plastic. Nothing else. And the plastic that is pervading the ocean, both in floating form and in form of those little molecules, those little grains of plastic, are an appalling hazard in the ocean. Now, is there any system that can actually deal with that? Or will your system create more of it?
At the moment, the technologies I'm talking about are at a very, very early stage of development, and I'm not aware of anyone asking how we would develop, say, biodegradable plastics from these sources. But I agree with you totally. That has to be the way forward. I mean, plastics As you say, they seem to last forever in the oceans. They're a major hazard for many forms of life, things from turtles through, as you know, to even fish in the oceans and through to seabirds. So we have to do something about that problem. I guess that brings up the issue, really, that climate change is one of a whole series of really big problems that we have to face, and quickly, and get on top of quickly. So, research and development, innovation, we need that for a lot of these areas.
Another one?
If I could just return to carbon fibres briefly, that really excited me as a discovery, because carbon fibres produce materials that are very light and very strong. They're used in aircraft hulls, for example, but they're expensive. And this discovery, the announcement said that the research allowed for the manufacture of carbon fibres at a fraction of the cost of current production processes. So that is exciting for two reasons. One, it'll gain funding just through the private sector. But secondly, if we can get carbon fibre cheap enough, it'll compete head-on with aluminium and steel, both of which are major emitters in the current economy. So if we can produce carbon fibres from atmospheric CO2, from a problem, in a cheap enough manner, that could be a very, very powerful tool in terms of addressing climate change.
But that's a long way ahead, Tim, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
The problem we're talking about is within the next decade, in the next 2 decades.
Look, it's true that the emissions reductions problem is something we have to deal with this decade or next. We'll be out of carbon budget and completely committed to 2 degrees of warming in the next 13 years. We know that, unless we reduce emissions. But the greenhouse gases, there's a delay in the way they act. So the full warming potential of the greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere today from having these lights on won't be felt for 2 or 3 decades. So there's a lag. So when we talk about the deployment of these technologies, we have to think about it in the context of that lag. So, and you're right that it's a long way off. It's, if you look at wind and solar PV, it's taken from the 70s when those technologies were invented to now for them to get to scale. It's been a multi-decadal journey of research and development and then building industries to scale and getting costs out, getting things to market. And the same will be true for these technologies, which is why I argue in the book we need to start now with that R&D and early scale development if we're to have a hope of having these ready and working at the gigaton scale by 2050. But given the lag in the warming potential, I think that there is a possibility that we can, if we cut emissions hard and fast now and develop these technologies now, we can still avoid 2 degrees of warming if we get on top of it. We have to see this as a project. I have to see it. Before I wrote the book, no one was talking about these technologies as a possible solution. No one was seeing them as a way forward as a whole. And I really do think we are now at the point where we have no choice. These have to be part of the solution. We can't hazard a geoengineering solution. We can't do that. It's too late to rely solely on emissions reductions. We have to have these other technologies.
Can you think of further examples of your solutions, or is that enough to be going on with?
Probably one more I should mention, which is really around carbon capture and storage. The conventional thinking around carbon capture and storage has been involved with coal-fired power plants and capturing the gas that comes out of them. And that, I think, is a failure. We've got to the point now where I don't think that's going to be a significant solution. But there are a group of very smart people out there, physicists and astrobiologists, who've looked at Earth and said, well, which parts of Earth where could we store CO2 in a way that would allow it to be naturally stable? And I've already mentioned one of those, which is the ocean crust, sediments of the ocean crust down at 3 kilometres of depth. That's one possibility. Another possibility is the high Antarctic ice cap. And the reason that's of interest is that its temperatures there average 57 degrees, minus 57 degrees Celsius. Sometimes it gets as cold as minus 90 Celsius up there. At minus 78.5 degrees Celsius, CO2 falls out of the air as snow, as carbon dioxide snow. And one of the proposals, and of course that happens naturally already in Antarctica when the temperature drops, but that snow just sublimates again as it warms and goes back to the atmosphere. But there is a proposal that we develop chiller boxes, very large chiller boxes, 100 metre cube chiller boxes over the Antarctic, power them using wind power, chill the air just a bit and excavate the snow under these chiller boxes, let the CO2 snow fall into the ice cap and then cover it with ice, and it will act as a permanent store for CO2. If you had about half the number of wind turbines that currently exist in Germany to power those chiller boxes, you could be storing a gigaton of carbon per year in the ice cap with that. Now when I read about that proposal, my first reaction was very negative. It seemed to me that Antarctica is the last great wilderness on the planet, should be allowed to stay that way. But when I reflected on that a bit, I thought, this is a bit of a NIMBY attitude, a bit of a not in my backyard attitude. And what's at stake could be the future well-being of my children and the children of everyone else on the planet. So should I really say we shouldn't be at least doing due diligence and research and development on this proposal, if in fact in 30, 35, 40 years' time it could be the difference of catastrophic climate change or not to our children? On more mature reflection, I came to the view that no, we shouldn't exclude this. We need to look at these possibilities because we may need them 25, 30, 35 years from now. So that gives people a sense of the many hundreds of potential options out there, some of which are tiny in scale, some of which are large in scale. And that some of the difficulties involved, and the fact that many of them are either desktop studies or at very, very early stages of development. But that basically is the proposal. And when I looked through it, did a conservative estimate of what these technologies might be drawing out of the atmosphere at scale 30 years from now, and the figure I came up with was about 40% of current emissions. And that's if you exclude things like seaweed farms that we don't understand enough about and Antarctic ice storage, but just use the things we do understand. So that's a very significant contribution. If we can do just that, we will be making a big difference to the lives of people who are going to be living 30 years from now.
Very well. Well, there you are, a number of solutions. What about some questions on these particular points, or indeed any others? Gentleman here.
Thank you very much. I'm Richard McCrory. I'm a lawyer at UCL. And I agree with you generally that I think technological solutions are going to be vital in this. I just want to pick up one point because I've been specialising in developing regulation for carbon capture and storage over the last few years. And you said it was a failure. And I wondered whether you meant it was a political and economic failure, because certainly in the UK at the moment it is, or actually technologically, because I'm not sure about, there's the Quest project in Canada,
right.
storage in Sleipner. I suspect it's more the politics and people thinking, well, is this just allowing us to carry on as we are, or is it a genuine bridging solution? But you just said it was a failure from coal, and I just wondered which bit of the failure.
No, look, thanks so much for that question, because it does need some clarification. The two big projects that have been built that involve coal-fired power plants are the Kemper County plant in the US and the Canadian plant that you mentioned. Both of them were completed over budget and over time. So they're more expensive than we thought, and they're just very complicated. And they don't even capture all of the emissions from those sources. My sense of the industry is that there's very little appetite for developing more of those plants. The cost of renewables is coming down so fast that they're looking very expensive compared with renewables plus some storage option even. I think the Sleipner example is a little bit different, where if you're pumping gas and you can just put the CO2 back in, that may be more of an option. There's certainly I don't know whether you're aware, but in Australia, the Gorgon project off the northwest of Australia, which has a lot of CO2 in the gas, is pumping that stuff directly back into sediments. So that as an option may be more favourable, but the conventional CCS story of taking exhaust CO2 from coal-fired power plants and putting it in the ground, I think we know the answer to that now. And it's just not going to be 5% of energy needs by 2050.
Thank you. I'm a fellow with the RSA. My question is, you talked about the fear of unilateral action, the China and the sulfur, but isn't there also the fear of trying to seek consensus? And how do you bridge the two by trying to get the world to act together, provide the money, and somebody to take decisions and move things forwards, as opposed to the other extreme of unilateral action.
Yeah. Are you talking specifically about geoengineering, so sulfur projects, or just more generally?
More generally, I mean, there are obviously all these routes, but how do you actually herd the cats and actually get people working in a common purpose and a common goal where compromises will have to be made?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I think if I can take the question in two parts. One concerns emissions reductions, and we clearly do need there a consensus agreement, because without that, the fear is that some people will just keep on polluting and others will bear the cost of reductions. So the Paris meeting is all about that. You know, if we get a strong signal out of Paris that the world has come to the view that we can't keep burning fossil fuels forever, and we've got a series of actions in place to reduce emissions as fast as we can at the moment, and with a short review period, I think that's as good as we'll get out of that process. And that's a really firm basis, really, for starting to reduce emissions at the fastest practical rate. When it comes to the funding of these technologies, I think that the answer is a little bit different, because the sources of funding and the stage of development they're at is so varied. There are some, for example, like carbon fibres, that will probably be funded directly from enterprise capital, from capital investment from the private sector. There are other solutions that might need a carbon price. So using silicate rocks, for example, is something that might require a carbon price, because there's no obvious product at the end of that beyond the drawdown of CO2. So a global carbon price needs a global consensus, so that will be something we'll see how that develops out of the Paris process. But there are many technologies that are somewhere in the middle, and seaweed farming is one of those, where you can imagine some components of large-scale seaweed farming might be profitable on their own as a source of protein for food, but there are other parts of that process, such as the storage of CO2, that would require either some regulation or some pricing mechanism as well that allows you to do that. My hope is that when people at the moment are looking at innovation funding, almost all of it is about clean energy at the moment. I think we need to expand our innovation funding to include some of the options in the third way. I think that investors need to start looking at this, and one of the great things about it, I suppose, is that we know the problem that people are going to be trying to solve in 2050. This gas isn't going to get out of the air of its own accord. It's going to be up there driving ever more adverse changes to our climate as time goes on. So we know that we have to have a solution. The only practical solution is third-way technologies. And I think we're in a position of privilege understanding that. We know what the problem is future generations will be trying to face. We can't know which of these technologies will be a winner, but we do know that if we're to deal with climate change now, some of these have to be brought to scale. So for investors, that's I think, a useful framing, if you want, of the problem.
There's a gentleman there. Oh, who? Yes. No, not. There.
Thank you. I'm Caroline Watson from Global Action Plan. Do you feel that, my sense is that we might have most of the solutions already. So you mentioned green technology such as solar and wind, and unfortunately we haven't done that properly yet. But if we had the political will and we actually implemented the technologies we have currently widely and as far as we possibly can, so every home and every building had solar and the grid was completely powered by renewables, would your longer term solutions that we don't really know that are proven yet, would they be necessary?
I do think they would be necessary, because could I take that in two parts, really? You're right that we have the basic technologies with wind and solar, but innovation in wind and solar is still going ahead of pace. There are thousands of patents being taken out in the solar sector, at the moment. I think there 4,000 or something over the last 5 years. There's still quite a number. So a lot of really early stage innovation is happening in those areas. The wind sector itself is changing incredibly. Again, I saw this working with Siemens, the advent of gearless wind turbines, the huge advantage that removes many hundreds of moving parts from a turbine. The idea that you can containerise wind turbines, so deliver everything to site in shipping containers, that's a reality. The use of 3D printers to keep turbine blades in pristine condition. All of this stuff is new research that's going to drive down the cost of electricity from wind and solar. So I think we've got the general solutions, but we don't have we haven't done enough innovation yet in those sectors to drive costs down to where they need to be over the longer term, or as low as they could go. The big problem is how quickly can we shift from the burning of fossil fuels? Even if you quadruple the deployment of wind and solar, you've still got problems. We've still got problems with intermittency. We need to develop battery technologies too. Electric vehicles, I would love it if we were at scale with electric vehicles now, we could move off liquid fuels. But Tesla, one of the leaders in the electric vehicle area, it's capitalised at half the value of GM until fairly recently. They only made 36,000 cars last year. We're at the very early stages. There's something like 80 million cars put on the road a year. So we're new cars. So, as I said, I don't think there are very few people I speak to who think we can move fast enough to reduce those emissions to avoid 2 degrees of warming. I'd love to be proved wrong with that. I'd love to see in 5 years' time we've done an incredible job. But, and there's another way of looking at that, which is that are we willing to live in a world with 1.5 degrees of warming, which we're committed to now? The gases in the air that'll make that happen. So do we want to live in a world without a Great Barrier Reef? If you don't, we're going to need to get some of the gas out of the air. We're going to need these third-way technologies to do that.
Very good. What about someone at the back there, in the middle? Back row, I think.
Are we too late to reduce population by birth control?
I didn't hear that.
Oh, are we too late to reduce population by birth control? Look, I'm not an expert on demographics, but my understanding of the situation is that the projections, the UN projections, are that by 2050 we'll have around about 9 billion people on the planet, a few more, and that there is still some room to alter that trajectory by limiting fertility. And the obvious way to do that is to just better the welfare of women in developing countries, give them more economic opportunity and more control over their own bodies. That's what's needed. And we can do that with our foreign aid budgets. We should be, I think, focusing on that. But a big part of that population increase, as I understand it, is coming from just people living longer. And it's a lot harder problem to solve in a way. We can't ask people to get off. We can't do that. So it's probably partially too late.
Yes, it may be too late, but it doesn't mean to say that it shouldn't be achieved simply because of the dignity of humanity.
That's
right. Anyway. There's a question there.
Hi, my name's Dan Dunleavy. Just a quick question. You haven't mentioned methane, and as David will know, belching cows and sheep produce rather a lot of that. And I saw when I was on the march on Sunday that it said if we all went vegan, we could cut emissions by 51%. I'm quite skeptical about that, but the key question is, what about methane, really? Because you've talked primarily about CO2.
Yeah, sure. Well, methane is responsible for, I think it's about, in round figures, 20% of the warming potential. And there's a whole lot of sources of methane. As you mentioned, cattle, ruminants are one, wetlands are another, permafrost is another. And for me, one of the biggest risks of approaching that 2-degree threshold is a release of methane, particularly from the Arctic tundra, a mass release. We know that releases of methane can occur and alter the climate very severely. There was a mass release of methane about 55 million years ago, which did that, spiked temperatures hugely and had a big impact. I was in Washington last month with one of the experts in that field, and he was saying that what they're learning now about that methane eruption 55 million years ago gives him great concern that we might be approaching a threshold. methane threshold. There's no easy solutions to that. We just have to reduce our risk as much as we can by cutting emissions as hard and fast as we can. But it's one of those things that is sort of beyond our control. Beyond that, we've just got to reduce our risk by keeping temperatures as low as we can. Just incidentally, though, there was one interesting development I didn't mention in terms of third-way technologies. A group of South Korean researchers announced last month, or the month before last, that they had developed a means of activating used coffee grounds to capture atmospheric methane. It never even occurred to me such a thing might be possible, but if the tundra does melt down, I'll be drinking 100 cups a day and shipping my grains off to Korea to get activated, I think.
At the back corner there.
Hi, hello. My name is Dorothy Maxwell. I'm Director at the Sustainable Business Group and an RSA Fellow. And I'm wondering if you have a view on the role of carbon pricing, and if we started to get the economics right, could we flip the market quicker to drive change, and how would that affect the type of technology solutions you're talking about?
Sure. Look, I do have a view on carbon pricing that I put in the book, and what I did with the book was try to assess the cost of removing CO2 per tonne from the atmosphere using various third-way technologies. And you can assume, given current conditions, a price of around $100 a tonne on average for taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So if that's the price for removing CO2 from the atmosphere, that surely should be the price for putting it in. The cost to the polluter, the cost to us all should reflect the cost of fixing the problem. So I think in any just world, a carbon price of around $100 a tonne is probably about right. That's far too high, I imagine, for industry to be, to accept. But we need to start somewhere with carbon pricing, and I think we do need a global carbon price. And I think that the schemes that are being developed in China now are a very interesting initiative in terms of carbon pricing. I do hear people talk about harmonising the European carbon price with the Chinese emerging carbon price over time, and the Californian carbon price. And if we do that, you've got a carbon market that's nearing a sort of global scale then, and you can imagine other players perhaps working in with that.
I think another two or three. We'll make it three. Sir. You, sir. Yeah. Oh, it's Crispin. Hello.
Well, first of all, we're very grateful to you for all the various solutions that you've suggested. But I suggest perhaps the biggest problem of all we face today, which is much discussed in Paris at the moment, is how you're going to persuade governments and people that some of these solutions are desirable and feasible. And I often think that the best way it has to be done, and from my own experience of climate change negotiations, this is obvious, is that you have to be able to persuade governments, authorities, institutions, individual citizens, that some of these solutions are really necessary. And so you really need to try and work out procedures which will enable people to understand more what is at stake and how everyone has to participate in finding solutions. And the usual solution, I think, which is most useful, is that in each case, in each country, you have to be able to display why it is that these things are in their interest. Whether you're talking about what's happening in the United States, where, as you know, it still remains a matter of high political controversy, or take some small African country like Mali or Ethiopia. In each case, you've got to be able to show that it's in the interest of that country and will win the support of communities and governments and institutions that this is the right thing to do. And so that, I think, is one of the things I hope will come out of Paris, is a better awareness of all this. But without that communication with the public and being able to explain why it's necessary to do these things, I don't think we're ever going to make much progress.
You want to respond?
Oh, yes. Look, Sir Crispin Tickell has just spoken, and what you say is so absolutely right. And you've seen it over decades now, the need for this. And really, that's why I wrote this book, was to try to get that debate going. Until I'd written the book, even myself, we weren't conceptualising these third-way technologies as a way forward. But once we understand that it is a possible way forward, we can then go to various nations, or nations can ask themselves the question, where is our strategic national advantage in this basket or portfolio of technologies? My recommendation to the Australian government and the Canadian government that I've been working with over the last few months is that we go to our academies of science. We go to the academies of engineering science and even the humanities and ask, can they provide some insight into where the national advantage lies across this very, very broad range of possibilities. So I think that that's probably one way forward, at least for research and development funding that comes from the government.
Right, a penultimate question down the corner there. Yes.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. What role do you see for nuclear in electricity generation?
That's a great question, and my view on nuclear has changed. 10 years ago I thought that it was likely to be an important part of the future energy mix. But if you look at what's happening with the nuclear industry, it's actually contracting for a number of reasons. So in the late 1990s it was generating about, I think, 17% of world electricity requirements. It's now about 12%. And in terms of actual megawatts, it's declined as well. Now, there's a few things like the Fukushima disaster that have happened that have affected it. But there are other factors at work as well. And one of them, I think, is the nature of capital markets. When you think about putting up a nuclear power plant, using conventional technologies, they have to be very large to be cheap per kilowatt. So you're looking at a 2,000 megawatt plant that's, in US dollars terms, probably $15-20 billion. They take years to plan and build, and they take 50 years to pay off, to go through. So you're locking up a lot of capital for a very long time in the hope of a return. And in the current market, your competition, if you want to do that, is wind and solar. And solar PV is reducing cost 10% year on year. Wind is, the costs of wind are likely to drop 50% over the next 5 years if these technological developments, get in place. And they're modular. You don't need to invest $20 billion to get them going. You can buy just a few solar panels or a few wind turbines. So they're much more, and the payback times are much shorter than for a nuclear power plant. So for all of those reasons, capital is going into renewable energy and not flowing into nuclear power plant development. The one area where we are seeing significant build in nuclear is in the command economies like China, where the government provides the capital and the government regulates and really assumes the risk. And there we're seeing some build. I think there's about 16 new nuclear power plants being built in China. But in economies such as Britain's or Australia, they're much less likely to go ahead unless the government assumes risk and provides some incentives.
Right, a last question, sir.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, the RSA. It's a question for both of you, if you don't mind, and in some ways especially David. It's a question about your intuition about human beings and our capacity to adapt. In the climate change, there's so many variables that you have to hold some things constant to make any traction. And it seems to me that in much of the discussion today, we hold human beings as constant. We kind of assume that we're not going to change that much, that we're stuck in our ways, we're creatures of habit and so forth. And my question to David really was, having observed creatures over many decades, including human beings, what is your instinct about our capacity to really grasp this fundamental problem and to transform our lives accordingly through shaping our habitats, shaping our values, shaping how we live our lives? Particularly David, if you can.
You start.
You're passing the hard one on to me. I mean, goodness. I think that we are changing as a species in quite fundamental ways. I think we're becoming a superorganism, as some of the termites and ants that you've studied so much, David, over time and revealed so much about. If you look at the way we're interconnected now with various technologies and the way ideas travel and unite people, I imagine half a century ago it was a very different world for you. So I think we are changing. I think our potentials are changing, but I don't know. I would like to.
Thank you. I listen to all these things. I'm also very keen on a project which has been called the Global Apollo project, which is that we should get all the developed nations of the world with major scientific resources to collaborate to work out a roadmap where we see where the difficulties are in using renewables entirely to fuel our thing. If we could get 1/5000th part of the energy which the sun puts on the earth every day, 1/5000th part, if we could utilize that, it would take care of the entire power requirements of the human race. So I don't believe that it's beyond humanity's ingenuity to do that. It has to be done, and one of the important proviso, at a price which undercuts coal and oil. And the moment you do that, you deal with all the arguments from Indians, for example, to say that the developed world owes it to the undeveloped world. We could make money, we could make energy cheaper that way, and everybody would opt to do it, and the carbon would lie in the earth unused. There is one huge problem to that, is that if we get cheap energy in that way, that humanity will go on devastating the earth in the way that we have done for the past few centuries. And what hope is there? No evidence that I can think of, that I can cling to, except the notion that, in the middle of the first quarter of the 19th century, it was perfectly acceptable to the human race to think that one man could own another and use him as a chattel. And yet, within half a century after that, slavery was something that was intolerable, that no civilized human being could even conceive. There was, in a mysterious way which nobody has analyzed properly, there was a huge change in the moral perspective of humanity. And it's my hope that somehow, if we go on talking about this, if we go on talking about the evils that somehow humanity will actually make another of those philosophical leaps, and it will become intolerable, just as intolerable slavery was intolerable. It was intolerable that we should misuse the energies and the capacity of this wonderful world, and that we should actually handle it not only for ourselves, but for the rest of the creatures with which we share the planet. It's now, we've exceeded our time. It's for my pleasure to thank Tim very much indeed for this very, very stimulating talk.